Hey, welcome to Psychology with Me, where we go over the things that I'm learning inside and outside the classroom in pursuit of a degree. We're continuing to go through the book Exploring Social Psychology. And when going over this module, I'm going to be honest, there's only one person that really came to mind when I started going over this module. With terms like self-serving bias, which is a tendency to perceive oneself favorably, false consensus effect, which is the tendency to overestimate the commonality of one's opinions and one's undesirable or unsuccessful behaviors, and even the false uniqueness effect, which is the tendency to underestimate the commonality of one's ability, one's desirable or successful behaviors. Mainly only one person came to mind. But the truth is, we may have more in common with him than we think. Most of us have a good relationship with ourselves. In studies on self-esteem, even low-scoring people respond in the mid-range of possible scores. In a study including 53 nations, the average self-esteem score was about the midpoint in every country. One of social psychology's most provocative yet firmly established conclusions is the potency of self-serving bias, which is a tendency to perceive oneself favorably. So we'll start with explaining positive and negative events. Many dozens of experiments have found that people accept credit when they're told that they have succeeded, and they attribute success to their ability and to their effort. However, they attribute failure to external factors, such as bad luck or a problem with inherent impossibility. We think of athletes that commonly credit themselves when things are going good, but they attribute losses to something else, whether it's bad breaks or bad referee calls. Driving. So in driving, we typically hear people say things like, the person came out of nowhere. Look, literally the other day, I was listening to somebody overhearing a conversation, and they were saying that a deer had committed suicide on their car. Self-serving explanations contribute even to marital discord and worker dissatisfaction. Divorced people usually blame their partners for the breakup, or managers often blame poor performance on workers or the lack of ability or effort, while workers blame external factors such as excessive workload or difficult coworkers. We help maintain our positive self-images by associating ourselves with success and distancing ourselves with failure. In school with grades, I got an A versus the teacher gave me a D. Well, see, the truth is that blaming failure or rejection on something external, even another's prejudice, is less depressing than seeing oneself as undeserving, or even I'd say unable. Now, what's funny about this is that most people, they have very little problem acknowledging their distant or past failings, those that are done by their quote-unquote former selves. So when describing old pre-college selves, university students offer nearly as much negative as positive statements. When describing their present selves, they offer 3 times more positive statements, saying things like, quote, I've learned and I've grown and I'm a better person today. Now, ironically, we are even biased against our own biases. What does that mean? Is that people claim to avoid self-serving bias themselves, but readily acknowledge that others commit the bias. This bias blind spot can have serious consequences during conflicts. If you're negotiating with your roommate over who does household chores more, and you believe your roommate has a biased view of the situation, you're much more likely to become angry. Apparently, we see ourselves as objective and everyone else is biased. So the question is, can we all be better than average? Self-serving bias also appears when people compare themselves to others. On subjective, socially desirable, and common dimensions, most people see themselves as better than the average person. Compared with people in general, most people see themselves as more ethical, more competent, more friendlier, more intelligent, better looking, more insightful, and even healthier than the average person. And get this, even men convicted of violent crimes rate themselves as more moral, yes, more moral, more kind, and more trustworthy than most. And even researchers have wondered, do people really believe their above average self-estimates? So, one experiment that they did is that they had the people bet real money when estimating their relative performance on tests. And they found that yes, people really believe their self-enhancing self-assessments. They believe the hype. Which moves us on to our next part, unrealistic optimism. Page 34. Now, optimism predisposes a positive approach to life. Now, studies of more than 90,000 people across 22 cultures reveal that most humans are more disposed to optimism than pessimism. It sounds strange, especially in our environment, our current world, where we see so much negativity and fear and all these things that are being pumped into us, that we're actually more prone to optimism than pessimism. But it actually says many of us have an unrealistic optimism about future life events. For example, most people expect their lives to improve in the next 5 years than to get worse. Even students perceive themselves as being far more likely than their classmates to get a good job, to draw a good salary, and even to own a home. They also see themselves as far more less likely to experience negative events, such as developing a drinking problem, having a heart attack before the age 40, or being fired. And this brings us next to illusory optimism. It says illusory optimism increases our vulnerability. Believing ourselves immune to misfortune, we do not take sensible precautions. I mean, we see that in a lot of things that we do, whether it's do we buy life insurance, or whether it is do we wear seatbelts, or whether it's, it's so many different things that you can see in big pictures, in the big picture, and then also in the small picture, where us presuming that it can't happen to us or it can't happen here really dulls our senses when it comes to taking these precautions. And although optimism is good, a dash of realism also is good as well. So what you start to see is that they're trying to establish the value of balance, of not being optimistic, but not too optimistic, and not being pessimistic, but also having a dash of realism as well. This dash of realism they call defensive pessimism. Defensive pessimism can sometimes save us from the perils of unrealistic optimism. Defensive pessimism anticipates problems and motivates effective coping mechanisms. It's found that students who are overconfident tend to underprepare, whereas their equally able but less confident peers study harder and get higher grades. Now we move on to false consensus and uniqueness. We have a curious tendency to enhance our self-images by overestimating or underestimating how much others think and act as we do. On matters of opinion, we find support for our positions by overestimating how much more others agree, and this phenomenon is called a false consensus effect. When we behave badly or fail in a task, we reassure ourselves by thinking such lapses are common. After one person lies to another, the liar begins to perceive the other person as dishonest. This gets even weirder. So, if we feel sexual desire towards another, we may overestimate the other's reciprocal desire. We tend to guess that others think and others act just as we do. I lie, but doesn't everyone? So if we cheat on our income taxes, smoke, or enhance our appearances, we are likely to assume or to overestimate the number of people who do as well. So the proverb may be true. We don't see things as they are. We see things as we are. Another fact is that also we're more likely to spend time with people who share our attitudes, behaviors, and consequently, who judge the world from the same view that we do. Now let's take it to matters of ability. On matters of ability, or when we behave well or successfully, however, a false uniqueness effect more often occurs. So on matters of ability, when we behave well or successfully, a false uniqueness effect more often occurs. Page 37 goes on to say that we serve our self-image by seeing our talents and moral behaviors as relatively unusual. So the things that we do well is more unusual, which I think in our minds makes us more unique. It makes us more valuable to the group. Now we're feeding more into self-esteem motivation. Why do people perceive themselves in self-enhancing ways? Perhaps a self-serving bias occurs because of errors in how we process and remember information about ourselves. Comparing ourselves with others requires us to notice, to assess, and to recall their behavior and ours. This creates multiple opportunities for flaws in our information processing. And so then our biased perceptions, then simply a perceptual error, an emotion-free glitch in how we process information, or are our self-serving motives also involved? It's now clear from research that we have multiple motives. In questing for self-knowledge, we're motivated to assess our competence. In questing for self-confirmation, we're motivated to verify our self-conceptions. In questing for self-affirmation, we're especially motivated to enhance our self-image. So trying to increase self-esteem then helps power our self-serving bias. Most people are extremely motivated to maintain their self-esteem, like all of us mostly. But in fact, to the point that college students prefer a boost in their self-esteem rather than eating their favorite food, engaging in their favorite sexual activity, seeing a best friend, drinking alcohol, or even receiving a paycheck. So, somewhat incredibly, self-esteem was more important than pizza, sex, and beer. So what happens when your self-esteem is threatened? For example, by a failure or by an unflattering comparison. Self-esteem threats also occur amongst friends, whose success can be more threatening than that of strangers. Now, there's a difference in how people handle it. So people with high self-esteem usually react to self-esteem threats by compensating for it, which is blaming someone else or trying harder the next time. These reactions help them preserve their positive feelings about themselves. Now, on the other hand, people with low self-esteem are more likely to blame themselves or give up. Okay, and so what underlies the motive to maintain or enhance self-esteem? Some believe that self-esteem is similar to a fuel gauge, and that relationships enable surviving and thriving. So the self-esteem gauge alerts us to threats of social rejection, motivating us to act with greater sensitivity to others' expectations. And even studies confirm that social rejection lowers self-esteem and makes people even more eager for approval. When spurned or jilted, we feel unattractive or inadequate. And this pain can motivate actions such as self-improvement or search for acceptance or inclusion elsewhere. Thank you guys. That's it, man. So thank you guys for joining me for Module 4, Self-Serving Bias. I hope you had a good time. I hope we learned a little bit more about ourselves and we're reminded about things that we already knew. So next up, our next module will be Module 5, Narcissism and the Limits of Self-Esteem.